So we don't lose too much time for this exciting panel. My name is Maïa Pal, and I'm an editor of the Board of Historical Materialism. Welcome to Saturday morning. Well done for making it at 10. And I'm very, very happy to introduce our speakers today. Do I need the mic, actually? No, maybe I do, yeah. Oh, yeah, because we are filming this live. Yes, is that correct? Live. Just evolutionary leaps of HM this year, just never ceases to amaze me. So we have four incredible speakers. Well, no, what am I saying? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 speakers and 4 papers. So we're going to start with Sandro Mezzadra and Michael Hardt. Apologies, I've had a cough for a week. If I need to leave at some point, I might have to go and cough. So apologies for my bad voice, but I have people on standby to take over. So Sandro Mezzadra is Professor of Political Theory at University of Bologna, and he'll be presenting with Michael Hardt. Will be followed by Morteza Samanpour, who's an editor at the Marx and Philosophy Review of Books. We will then go to Michele, who I forgot his last name, very sorry, Basso, Michele Basso, and Eleonora Cappuccilli, who Eleonora is a Marie Curie fellow at the University of Oslo, and Michele is a researcher at the University of Padua. And we will then go to Feyzi Ismail, who's a lecturer at Goldsmith, and that will be our final paper. And I forgot to say Michele and Eleonora are part of the Precarious Disconnections Collective, so I don't know if they'll talk a bit more about that, but yeah. We'll have 15 minutes for each paper, we'll take them in turn, and then we'll take questions and answers following that. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Sandro and Michael. Thank you very much.
Yes, good morning. Would like to start by saying that it is not easy for us to be here with you and to talk at the panel today. Tonight, a very dear friend of ours passed away. Paolo Virno has been an evolutionary militant and a great philosopher. We are kind of moved. You will see that it is not easy at all for me to talk. We just want to remind him at the beginning of this panel.
Just one thing I thought before going on, I was reminded of that passage in Foucault's interview about the homosexual way of life, in which he says that it's not homosexual acts that are disruptive and dangerous, but rather the homosexual way of life. And then he has this beautiful list of qualities that are presented as different and new, a new tenderness, camaraderie, friendship, love, interactions. I was thinking that Paolo, in some ways, in addition to his political organization capacities, his intellectual organization capacities, that also these, he in some ways presents, along with a communist way of life, the dangerousness and the beauty of these of a different way of life, something like that. Okay, I'm not saying it great, but anyway, I'm trying to come to terms with it. Okay, so we have to shift gears. So Sandro and I are presenting together, and we sort of have a coordinated presentation. I'm going to try to look at to see how 7 minutes goes, and then I'll just cut off. We want to start thinking, and we're both going to in some ways refer to the sequence we find in Lenin's small book about imperialism. You know, the way a sort of summary of the book you could have is that the concentration of capital in monopolies, the concentration of power in the state leads to a second term, which is imperialism, and in a way inter-imperialist conflict, and that leads to war. Inter-imperialist war, as he's talking about then, this sort of 3-part sequence, a logical sequence, political sequence. And I wanted to start with the end, and then I think Sandro is in some ways going to fill in the beginning, start with the end, meaning war. And we find this Lenin sequence helpful, not only for the continuities with the contemporary, but also thinking some of the differences. And so we want to, the first thing I guess I want to start with is this notion of war regime, which Sandro and I are trying to develop to confront the contemporary situation, by which we understand not only open military conflicts, of which there are many, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, you can go through a long list, but also how militarization is influencing different spheres, in fact, a wide variety of spheres of life, economic militarization, a social militarization, a political militarization. I presented this recently, and a friend said, well, okay, well, I was fighting in Rojava, and you don't know what you're talking about. War is war, and you're talking about something different. And that's certainly true. Differences of quality, not only degrees. But nonetheless, I think that it's useful, and we're finding it useful at least to try to think a continuity among the militarization and war in these different spheres. So let me just give you a brief idea of what I mean by that. So in the economic sphere, which Sandro is going to talk about more, you could think about Rearm Europe as a militarization of the economy, but it's a militarization of the economy that's not only affecting the economy, also social spending and various other social spheres. Sometimes the trade wars, Trump's trade wars, certainly with the threat of military action behind them, is another kind of militarization of the economic sphere. In the social sphere, you can think of a variety of wars that are called wars, but then I'll think in a minute about how they are. Wars on migrants, wars on trans people, wars on cities in the US, especially now, gender wars. I think these are fundamentally different than we're used to having a metaphor of war about social programs. I mean, think of in the US of the war on poverty started in the 1960s, or even the war on drugs. It seems to me these are fundamentally, they involved a certain amount of violence, obviously. War on drugs involved mass incarceration, racialized mass incarceration, but they were primarily metaphors, it seems to me, that involved the war aspect of it was meant to indicate a total social mobilization. That's what they meant by war. It seems to me that the wars, social wars we're seeing today are not just metaphors. That the war on migrants, for instance, in the US involves military elements. Certainly the war on migrants in the Mediterranean involves military elements, involves death, etc. Surveillance regimes, one could add to this in the social wars. Political wars, I guess just one element I wanted to, there are many ways you could think of the way in the political sphere that war is entering. I was thinking primarily about, here one example, just about the way that territorial expansion has returned as part of the political imaginary. That when Russia invaded Crimea, you could think, okay, Russia's the exception. Or even the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, that's an exception about territorial expansion. Israel and its various expansions into the West Bank and Gaza, but also into Syria and Lebanon, etc., you could think, okay, Israel's still the exception. Then Trump's imaginary of Canada, Panama, Gaza, etc., I think it's indication that this notion about territorial expansion, which in some ways blurs the division between war and politics, is part of this. So this is roughly just to give you an idea, super fast, I guess, of what we mean by a war regime. In some ways, it seemed useful for us at a certain point to think about when Fanon talks about the colonial space as an atmosphere of violence. So in some ways, we're thinking about this war regime as an atmosphere of war, in the same sense that he meant it there, that it was pervasive. That's my way of thinking. Another way you might think about it, sort of in a similar vein, is when Césaire talks about how the generalization of the colonial practices to Europe is what the Nazi regimes afforded. And in some ways, I think that's also in some ways relevant here, of recognizing this continuity. And primarily what I want to get to, but I might run out of time for it, is the way this indicates, like what seems important about this to us is the way this indicates a shift in the form or the technologies of power, and which, of course, here's the real importance, that will require different practices for resistance and liberation. Was that the end of my time? No, okay, good. Okay, then by global, it said war regime, by global war regime, we mean not only that these phenomena are tendentially expanding across the planet in different forms and different intensities, obviously, but rather a methodological principle that we operate by. And one way of understanding it is calling this a supranational analogy. By this we mean, so in international relations, in the field of international relations, there's a notion of a domestic analogy in which the idea is that each state acts like an individual actor, and therefore one should read the interactions among states in analogy with the individual actors. That this is continuity with the so-called realist method in international relations. And we're in a way reversing that analogy. So we should interpret local national situations as manifestations of global dynamics and relations. In some ways, to read the analogy with the global. It's a method, but it's also a claim about causality. A claim about causality meaning that the supranational level is the key to understanding of these domestic situations. Sandro is going to talk more about this. You could also, just to situate it in your own mind, think about Marx's reliance on the world market as a starting point for understanding capital. I mean, I think it's similar to the supranational method of ours. If I've got a couple more minutes, I wanted to say that I think this global war regime signals a shift in the nature of power structures, as I mentioned before, the technologies of power. And one way of understanding it, which is imperfect, but nonetheless seems to be useful, is thinking of it as an end of hegemony and a shift in the relations between force and consent. By hegemony here, I'm meaning simply the predominance of consent over force in relations of power, and correspondingly thinking domination as a concept in contrast to hegemony as the predominance of violence or force. And that's what we're trying to capture with this notion of the war regimes. There's, of course, not an absolute shift, but it's a question of balance between the two. So, I mean, for instance, when I say the predominance of force over consent, I mean, we haven't arrived at the point of locking up trans people, all of them, or forcing pregnant women or people to give birth. But so there isn't just an absolute question of force. But like I say, a kind of shift. One example that seems in a different domain that seems useful or interesting to me is the shift in the US global ambitions, let's say. It seems to me that US imperialism in the second half of the 20th century functioned with large doses of violence and force, of course, but also, and I would say primarily, constructed mechanisms of hegemony. I mean, the so-called soft power of the US, generating consent at different levels, of course, and in different populations. But nonetheless, that was an important part of it. And one of the things we've seen from these months of the Trump second term is a systematic destruction of all those forms of soft power. Just as examples, the destruction of USAID, which was always a element of US imperialism, of US global hegemony, but nonetheless had also other effects. The destruction of the propaganda campaigns of Voice of America, etc. I would say even maybe it's a more complicated example to talk about the role of the US university. I mean, the role of non-US students at the US university, which has always been the best part of the US university, that destruction of that in the recent years, which seems to me something that'll be difficult to bring back, that has always functioned as a form of soft power, of non-US students coming to study in the US and often returning to their own countries, etc. So perhaps what we mean by war regime in all these domains is a shift towards dominance over hegemony. I would be tempted to talk about this in relation to Foucault. I would find it interesting in the sense that, I mean, it might be a shift in his work towards more talking about not just race war, the way he talks about it, but he often talks about an inversion of Clausewitz's formula. Like rather than politics being an extension of war, he says we have to understand, no, the other way around. I did it wrong. Rather than war being an extension of politics, by which Clausewitz meant international policy or diplomacy, that politics now is an extension of war. And I think this, rather than I think, the primary technologies of power that he was working on in the 1970s, about discipline, about biopower, governance, these were all methods, it seems to me, that function along the lines of hegemony. They were production of subjects that would consent, like the notion of docile bodies itself. And so there are elements, it's time. Okay, there are elements of, I'll just say the last sentence, I don't know what it was. Oh yeah. I mean, they're obviously in Foucault's notions. Oh yeah, we would say, Foucault often said, there's still elements of sovereignty. There's no question about that. He was talking about a predominance of and a shift. I'm not sure it's quite right to say that we're returning to the epic of sovereignty in Foucauldian terms. I mean, of course, there are spectacular forms of violence that are done. I mean, think about Gaza itself as an extraordinary example of that, or ICE agents arresting people in a kind of spectacular fashion is a return of sovereignty. It seems to me it's something different, though, and that's what I'd like to question. But I'm going to stop there and pass to Sandro. Thank you.
So as Michael was explaining, we take what we call Lenin's sequence in his analysis of imperialism as a point of reference for understanding the current world conjuncture. And we focus attention on the momentous processes of concentration of capital we have been witnessing over the last years, in particular in the field of big infrastructural platforms. The COVID-19 pandemic was at the same time a moment in which this process became visible and a moment in which they were accelerated. So we are facing processes of concentration of capital, and we remind that such processes were for Lenin, and not only for Lenin, even for Hannah Arendt, the basis of imperialism. What we ask is whether we are facing today a situation that is comparable with the one analyzed by Lenin. Lenin was emphasizing the fact that there were parallel processes of concentration. Concentration of capital and concentration of power in the state. And according to Lenin, there was a merging of these processes with the state, the national state, becoming a kind of collective capitalist. Is something comparable happening today? We think we have, first of all, to focus attention on the transformations that have reshaped both capital and the state over recent decades. And we have often emphasized that today there are increasing gaps between what Giovanni Arrighi used to call capitalism and territorialism. And we have always thought that these gaps were kind of challenging the possibility of a classical imperialist politics. In a way, what we are facing today is an attempt, in particular, by the second Trump administration to close the gaps between capitalism and territorialism by violently reimposing the national denomination of capital as a guiding principle. This is something that has a lot to do with what Michael was saying before regarding a shift from hegemony to domination. We have been talking about an emergent multipolar world, and we have stressed the fact that this emergent multipolarism is a centrifugal and conflictual multipolarism. To put it very quickly, because I have just 1 minute or 2 minutes, what we are witnessing today is an attempt to turn the poles of this emergent multipolar world into blocks, into military blocks. We think that imperialism today must be analyzed precisely against this backdrop, that this attempt to turn poles into block is precisely, of course, at a very general and abstract level, what makes up the threat of imperialism today. And our task is to shed light on the limits, on the weaknesses of these attempts. We have insisted on several kind of structural limits and weaknesses, both regarding the composition of what Marx used to call aggregate capital and regarding international relations. But we are convinced that the real limits, the most important limits, are the social and political struggles that challenge, not only in the US, but in many parts of the world, this global war regime. It is from this point of view that a reinvention of internationalism becomes necessary. And this is the topic of a workshop that we will have tomorrow. Thank you.
Yes, people want to come and sit with 30 seats over here. So, then we will now give the material.
Can I begin? Yeah. So I think I'll start with where Sandro and Michael left with the question of internationalism. I want to go straight to the heart of the matter and ask, given the war conjuncture we are inhabiting today,
Morteza.
Yes, given the war conjuncture we are inhabiting today, what modes of internationalism, understood broadly as the political form that composes resonance, solidarity, and mutual articulation across heterogeneous struggles of liberation on the basis of their common grounds and shared destinies, can we develop so that we would be able, so that they would be capable not only of denouncing genocide and imperialist warfare, but of practically contesting them or ultimately abolishing them. A concrete response to the above question, concrete in the Marxian, Hegelian sense as a multiplicity of conceptual determinations, cannot be given in abstraction from historical experiences and actually existing political struggles. So I would also approach it through the existing political divisions that have globally emerged within anti-imperialist struggles from the context of the Middle East, especially in the aftermath of October 7. But before going into that, let me note that Sandro Mezzadra and Bert Nelson's analysis of the transformation of capital and power in their book, The Rest and the West, together with Sandro and Michael's ongoing collaborative work on the war regime, has been crucial for elaborating a critical historical diagnosis of the present. I am referring both to the formulation of the logistical transformation of capital, the distinctively transnational reconfiguration of its reproduction through ports, corridors, and special economic zones that simultaneously unify and differentiate various modes of subsumption and circulation, and also to their critical reconstruction of the category of multipolarity, which Sandro just mentioned, whereby the historical West is no longer at the center of the world market, and the notion of pole itself cannot simply be reduced to geopolitical speciality of interstate relations. So it seems to me these two historical ontological mutations of contemporary capitalism, logistical and multipolar transformation, are indispensable for any attempt to renew internationalism today in a way that is attuned to the rhythms of the present, namely the disjunctive temporalities of the current war conjuncture, in which warfare is no longer a deviation from the normal course of global reproduction, but increasingly the very social form through which it is organized. And I don't have to go into the question of logistic as the object, medium, and result of warfare. And I will set that aside in my paper. So, okay, internationalism. Grounded in intertwined destinies of oppressed classes, internationalism has clearly entered into crisis. When life is reduced to sheer survival under conditions of total warfare, or worse, when life is annihilated through an accelerated and intensified form of genocide, the social soil is prepared for the emergence of political positions and tendencies that led uncritical support to any forces or states opposed to the West, regardless of their own internal forms of domination or their regional interventions. Under such circumstances, campism, often derided as also tankism, is in a sense understandable, yet it is increasingly out of sync with the emerging multipolarity of contemporary capitalism, which pluralizes imperialist domination beyond the historical West. So the following argument is that any renewed internationalism today within the multipolar landscape of contemporary capitalism not only needs at the same time to confront campism, but also the dialectics of campism and Western imperialism, the uneven dialectics between the two. And by that, I'm going to talk a little bit about this in relation, for example, to the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. So to renew internationalism today requires not only a critique of Western imperialism and the axis of resistance, or any other pole for that matter, but also a critique of their mutually reinforcing representations. Take, for instance, the 12-day war, as it is called, between two seemingly antagonistic narratives. On the one hand, Western imperialism and Zionism cast the Islamic Republic of Iran as the puppeteer of an axis of evil, eternally on the verge of a nuclear weapon in order to legitimize their own imperialist warfare. On the other hand, campism endorses Iran's self-image as the vanguard of anti-imperialist resistance, while suspending critique of Iran's brutal regional interventions, for example, in Syria, and its internal domination, most recently laid bare during the Woman Life Freedom Uprising. So the West renders the Islamic Republic an other through a colonial conception of historical time that denies temporal co-equalness, attributing an anachronistic pre-capitalist temporality allegedly outside the capitalist present, Campists, on the other hand, imagine the Islamic Republic as a genuine alternative to the imperialist capitalist order, as if positioned outside the very world it contests, i.e. ahead of its time. Both narratives exceptionalize the Islamic Republic through a linear politics of time linked by dialectical inversion. One anachronizes Iran as lagging behind the present, too late. The other vanguardizes it as ahead of imperial time, too early. Mirror images, they flatten the coeval plural temporalities of Israel and Iran as capitalist states within the same yet internally differentiated globalized present, each striving to shape the Middle East in its own image. To situate Iran and Israel or any other force at war within the same present is not, and I want to really insist on that one, it's quite crucial to underline. To situate them within the same present is not to equate two states irrespective of their evident differences, especially their position within global hierarchies. Nor is it to deny the extreme unevenness of the 12-day war. Rather, it is to insist that the geopolitical grammar of Rest and West, which accords primacy only to struggles against Western imperialism, is no longer sufficient in conditions of multipolar capitalism. Whereas campism invokes multipolarity normatively, celebrating the ascent of states such as China and Russia as a contemporary response to Western decline, here multipolarity is treated, following Mezzadra, as an objective condition of power. Multiple poles composed of heterogeneous actors, states and transnational capital and other forms of institutions are irreducible to fixed geopolitical blocks, and they strive in common to control and reconfigure the spatio-temporalities of global circuits of accumulation. So I don't go into Giovanni Arrighi's stuff that is already mentioned. And so in contrast to this multipolarity, campism reduces non-Western powers, such as Russia, to mere victimized negative of Western imperialism, as if they projected power only for deterrence and national sovereignty, rather than to extend their own influence through imperialist practices. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is often narrated as a purely defensive response to NATO imperialist expansion, while the formation and expansion of the axis of resistance are cast solely as deterrent mechanisms, not as attempts to actively reshape the region. So I'm going to now talk about a little bit about different forms of campism now. Campism is often identified through a somewhat simplified logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. A logic that either brackets the repressive internal forms of those forces opposed to the West, or denies their own subjectivity in actively shaping the world market. These pure forms of campism tend to abstract the inside and the outside of non-Western societies, granting primacy only to struggles against Western imperialism. By prioritizing anti-imperialist struggle through support for, say, Iran, campism obscures not only Iran's geopolitical interventions in the region, but also its internal forms of domination. In doing so, it installs a homogeneous leading time, the state's wartime cadence, to which labor, feminist, and minority struggles are told to defer, not now. Campism thus imposes a false synchronization in which heterogeneous struggles with distinct horizons, urgencies, and rhythms are subsumed under a single wartime rhythm. Everything is made sequential to the so-called primary struggle under a permanent emergency of threatened national security, presented as the precondition for everything else. The result is an anti-imperialism abstracted from the plural forms of domination integral to the reproduction of capital in Iran as elsewhere. I'm gonna skip the question of abstract universality here. Good decision.
Well, ask you the question that was.
Yeah. I have time still, right?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, right. Okay, so since its violent birth, the Islamic Republic of Iran has projected an anti-imperialist self-image, presenting itself as the state that supports Palestinian resistance, opposes US Zionist imperialism in the region, and recently even fights ISIS. This illusory self-image, however, has had real effects among audiences disillusioned with Western imperialism or sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, especially after October 7. In reality, however, the discourse of anti-imperialism has been integral to the Islamic Republic's political governance, functioning as an alibi to cloak and legitimize repression in the name of resistance to the West, which is not, by the way, exclusive to Iran, but characteristics of many ex-Soviet and third world countries. So, for example, compulsory hijab has been ideologically justified as a bulwark against cultural imperialism cast in the rhetoric of West toxification, or what is called in Persian Gharb Zadegi. In the meantime, the internationalist modes of political organization and positions that doubly negates Western imperialism and Israel genocide, as well as the so-called axis of resistance, have been extremely contested and subjected to all forms of accusations since October 7. From idealism in the sense of asking reality to conform to its own predetermined principles, to puritanicalism for insisting that the feminist, egalitarian, and anti-colonial horizons of woman life freedom oppose both the Islamic Republic and Israel's invasion at the same time. In wartime, we are repeatedly told one must prioritize, get one's hands dirty, and face the real contradictions. By contrast, and I will wrap it up, political subjects inside Iran, from students and teachers to workers and feminists and political prisoners, including the Kurdish militants on death row, Pakhshan Azizi and Barishe Moradi, together with explicitly internationalist diasporic organizations, affirm a different politics of time, not governed by the realist injection of first national security, then everything else. A counter-synchronization that linked woman life freedom to Palestine.
Now's your time, ideally. We'll now move to Eleonora and Michele.
Sorry, of course. Sorry.
Grazie.
So good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here this morning. And I also wanted to commemorate Paolo Virno, a great comrade, philosopher, thinker, and may he rest in power. So the presentation of today, and unfortunately we cannot show you the PowerPoint because we had the cover of this wonderful book that is currently just in Italian, but it will be soon translated, or it has been translated in English, and it's called In the Third World War, a lexicon for the struggles of the present. And possibly next year we'll present it here at HM. So it's a collective elaboration against the war. Was written by our collective called the Connessioni precarie disconnections. So with the Permanent Assembly Against the War, which was formed within the Transnational Social Strike Platform, we tried to find ways to break the fronts of the war. Activists from Russia and Ukraine started to discuss with others from literally every part of the world. After October 7th, 2023, and the invasion of Gaza, the assemblies expanded to include Palestinians and Israelis, again, trying not to get sucked into the logic that builds existential enemies. However, the experience of many organized assemblies showed us the limits of the discourses and initiatives to oppose the war. The different positions have often resulted in paralysis or to the choice to put the war aside, to seek convergence on anything but ways to oppose it effectively. In this book, we therefore discuss some of the words, concepts around which the discourse of war transcends the battlefields, redefining entire areas of political intervention. Some of the concepts are migrants, climate conflict, state, or the key words of its legitimation, like militarism, and its difficult contestation, like decolonial and resistance. The political hypothesis underlying this work is based on this critique of war and the realization that, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Third World War has begun. Here, we are not interested in pursuing the geopolitical dimension of the war. We are not interested in war as a system of order, within which different regimes can certainly be identified. In this book, we look at war from the point of view of the living labor in its heterogeneity, in the conviction that finding our part within the war and across its fronts is the first step towards overturning its logic. Like the first two world wars, the game played in the third is not the hegemony of one or more states, but rather the government of the living labor in the war market. The question is not how to prevent war from spreading, but how this war can end. At stake is the possibility of producing organizational processes that match the transnational importance of living labor. We coined the slogan for a transnational politics of peace. We wanted to look at war from the perspective not only of the danger, death, and destruction to be avoided, but also of the organizational processes we can open up in and against it. For social movements of men and women, the problem is not the contingent causes of wars, but how to end this war. Yet, the Third World War is characterized by the difficulty of deploying living labor compactly and continuously within its own front. Total mobilization is neither possible nor conceivable, because the Third World War is both cause and effect of the difficulties of controlling labor power to articulate accumulation processes on a global scale. Today, states are in a transnational environment characterized by disorder and the struggle for the most advantageous positions. The Third World War is the military form of this ongoing clash. And like the transnational space, it is in danger of having a savage character, refractory to any regulation, with the presence of capitalist actors who are now fully transnational, but who claim to use state and international rules to their advantage. There is no possibility of an international government of the war, while all attempts to establish it through partial agreements end up establishing the basis for its continuation. The now constitutively mobile character of living labor, and not only of conflicting components of capital and institutions, means that war cannot become a regime. This consideration poses the need to experiment with the organization of political forms that can consolidate the strength of social movements over time. The real possibilities of this change impose the problem of political connections capable of establishing a field of visibility and communication that, without denying their differences, allows the figures of living labor to escape the classifications to which they are constantly subjected by war. How then to advance the possibility of a political opposition to the Third World War as a class struggle? First of all, the Transnational signals the need to overcome any political reading that traces the fronts based on state or anti-imperial alliances, or culturalist hypotheses that divide the world between a West and the rest. There have been real movements in recent years and also recent months that have hinted at a possible transnational class constitution. Exemplary in this sense is the social movement of migrant labor, which has broken down any historical or futuristic scheme of international division of labor, imperial and colonial, center and periphery, in the world market, without any possibility of recomposing it. The feminist movement has also acted transnationally by experimenting with forms of organization against the patriarchal oppression that underpins production and social reproduction. In this sense, women and migrants point to possible points of connection with the living labor movement, which, by rejecting the conditions of its exploitation, determines an unceasing economic competition between capitals to control the labor force, which pushes capital to take on an increasingly transnational dimension. Final part for my half speech on imperialism. So the return of imperialism and anti-imperialism in social movement discourses, together with the reference to resistance, has significantly characterized reactions to the war. This happened with the war in Ukraine, where the Russian invasion prompted some to support, in the name of anti-imperialism, Ukrainian militarism. They have fueled the illusion of a people's resistance in Ukraine and new forms of political, economic, and cultural nationalism. In a specular way, anti-American, anti-imperialism prompted support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine from an anti-NATO perspective, and thus meant supporting the war. The anti-imperialist lexicon, along with the decolonial lexicon, has also covered the war in Palestine. Many saw the unprecedented action of the 7th of October and the following genocide in Gaza as a continuation of the decades of occupation, apartheid, and violence. The ideological trap of the historical opposition between a Western civilization and Eastern barbarism, or its reverse, and an Eastern and Southern global resistance against Western domination, has constantly thrown movements back into a territorial cage. The main limitation of anti-imperialism is that it fuels a vision in which states remain the absolute protagonists of politics, when in fact their role, although relevant, is always partial and unstable. Similarly, when the imperialist tendency is transferred to large multinational corporations like Amazon, capital is given an autonomy that does not consider it in its social relationship with living labor. And I pass the mic to my friend.
Thank you. I will follow the perspective of the book, of the same book mentioned by Eleonora. Just a word to say that the book is the result of a collective writing, which is in itself a political practice. And it is a word on a lexicon. So, as Eleonora already said, it is an effort to confront, a collective effort to confront the limits of discourses and the limits of the use of certain words and concepts within these discourses. The words and the concepts widely used in journalism and in common sense to try to describe and understand the international disorder seem not to be able to grasp the core, sometimes the core of what's happening. Eleonora mentioned some words, I mentioned other ones, words like state, imperialism, war meant as a conflict between states, but also words which are normally positively connotated, like democracy or resistance. This doesn't mean that we are forced to invent new words, no new speak is needed, but that we have to try to understand what's happening in a different way, and what we try to do in the book and in our collective discussions is to try to connect what at first glance seems to be disconnected. The most important connection is that between war and living labor. The war is no longer only a matter of a clash between states. This is common sense between scholars. Consider the works of Mary Elder, John Enyu, Saskia Sassen. But you can see it also just by consulting the Uppsala Conflict Data Program online. You can watch all the wars ongoing every day, unfortunately, in the world. But the words used by some scholars and the same data program to describe war, I mean words like, or concepts like hybrid war, post-national war, regimes of sovereignty, the expression used by John Enyu, private war, interstitial war, and sovereignty, like Dylan Craig contends. Sometimes these words run the risk to reproduce the logic and the distinction they would claim to overcome. The book states that, and I quote here, the game played in the Third World War is not primarily a sort of hegemony, but rather the government of the living labor in the world market. End of quotation. The connection between capital and war is, of course, long-lasting, but whereas in the so-called neoliberal regime, control over the market, the production, the supply chains, and ultimately over the living labor on the one side, and war on the other one, these 2 points, war and exploitation, were put sometimes side by side. Now they seem more and more to overlap. Michael Hardt said some minutes before, militarization is influencing different spheres, and Morteza, if I pronounce well the name, spoke of war as a social form. Okay, thank you. This call into question, in particular, one of the most important traditional categories about war, that between polemos and stasis, or in modern terms, between internal and external war. Sandro Mezzadra and Michael Hardt spoke also of, they said also war has been internalized. See on this point also a recent book by Alessandro Colombo on civil war. The neoliberal regime is not substituted, but integrated by a regime of militarization. In this perspective, it is from this perspective that it seems appropriate to speak of Third World War, or as it has been said, an atmosphere of war. This dimension where war is intertwined and internalized to market, the supply and production chains and exploitation of living labor is called in the book transnational. Transnational here, and I quote, marks the rupture of the forms of political and institutional mediation between capital and labor, but we could say also between capital and war, that have settled over the course of the 20th century. Transnational, I quote again, is the reality of the world market, but also the movements of living labor that oppose that reality by advancing a claim of liberation from exploitation and oppression. In this sense, and I'm going to conclude, just 3 minutes, okay, only by taking, first point, conclusions. Only by taking the perspective of the social movements that one can understand the war, and social movements include women, LGBTQ+, precarious workers and migrants. Second, political organization must operate at the same level of the main political event and processes. that is at a transnational level. What is needed is an adequate elaboration of a transnational politics, the political essence of living labor in order to oppose the Third World War. In a similar way, Sandro Mezzadra and Michael Hardt called for a reinvention of internationalism in their recently published introduction to the portal, and even today. I finally come back to the subtitle, Political Lexicon for the Struggle of the Present, trying to sum up. In an ongoing collective discussion, we propose a reflection on the main concepts we use when speaking of war and imperialism, and we contend that only a diffuse aggregation and a collective organization, you can find this distinction in Rodrigo Núñez's book on political theory, a collective aggregation, a collective organization and diffuse aggregation of living labor can help to counter the emerging regimes of war. An effective politics of peace can emerge only through this organization. Thank you.
So increasing attention is being paid to scrutinizing warfare as a crucial driver of carbon emissions and ecological destruction. And rightly so, given the current conjuncture of endless war and therefore increasing military emissions. Israel's genocide in Gaza and Russia's invasion of Ukraine are the most prominent and high-tech. In the first 2 months of Gaza's destruction, Israel produced over 99% of the estimated 281,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide generated as a result of the war. 15 months in, this shot up to 1.89 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which includes the aerial bombardment and the ground invasion of Gaza. The carbon footprint is greater than the annual emissions of 100 countries combined. All of this excludes emissions, of course, from the entire war supply chain. The true carbon footprint could be 5 to 8 times higher, according to Ben Niemark and colleagues on the Military Emissions Gap project, because indirect emissions are higher. These are so-called downstream emissions released as a consequence of the use of force, but also the emissions associated with reconstruction. So the most significant carbon cost, an estimated 30 million tons of CO2 equivalent, will come from the rebuilding of Gaza, which Israel has reduced to over 60 million tons of toxic rubble. That's 20 times more than the combined debris generated by all wars since 2008. It should be said that an increasing focus on carbon emissions from war and making the links between war and climate change is not to diminish the devastating loss of life during war. And we mustn't forget the 10 to 14,000 Palestinian bodies buried under that rubble. It is rather to underline the fact that the damage done to the natural environment also means an inability to survive, if not immediately, then ultimately. And yet, if global military expenditure is any indicator, it was a colossal $2.7 trillion last year and is set to rise even further under NATO calls for the allocation of 5% of GDP to defense spending, then we are heading towards more war. We should also remember that Western militaries themselves, mainly the US and UK, are also paying a great deal of attention to the climate crisis. Reporting military emissions is voluntary, but there's even more secrecy around all of that. Only a few weeks ago, the Joint Intelligence Committee in the UK, which coordinates intelligence assessments on national security and foreign affairs and defense, declared that national security is under severe threat from the climate crisis, that food shortages are merely a few years away, and that climate-induced migration is a massive concern. They never put out the report. They were supposed to put out this report in the public domain, but pulled it back. And one can only suspect that it's being edited for a public consumption if it is ever released. Nevertheless, the way government defense chiefs are spinning this looming crisis is in terms of national security. The security threats posed by the climate crisis cannot be met, they argue, if we treat climate and defense as separate issues. And by the way, increases in defense spending are non-negotiable. And this is coming from Lieutenant General Richard Nugi, who served in Iraq, was Army Chief of Staff in Afghanistan, and also led the Ministry of Defense's review into climate change policy in 2021. He epitomizes the view that climate breakdown inevitably fuels instability and is a driver of war, rather than the other way around, that Britain's historical and contemporary role as an imperialist power and staunch partner of US imperialism is a driver of the climate crisis. And as expected from a supporter of capitalist warmongering, but still revealing, Nugi also declares that the main reasons why the MOD is paying any attention to the climate at all is for two reasons. One, because they want to secure military advantage. He's quite open about that. It's not about protecting the planet. And two, they want to save money. The idea is that climate change is affecting our way of life, and it's that needs to be protected. Pure adaptation on the assumption that there is nothing we can do. I want to put forward three arguments around how we might analyze, mobilize, and perhaps begin to confront, to make a difference in confronting the ecological costs of imperialism and war. The first one is around understanding the state, its associated class interests, and the crisis of the imperial project. The second is linking the question of war to the economic. And the third is recognizing where people are at and mobilizing on a mass working class basis. So first, I think we need to see the prospect of endless war as part of a competitive imperialist system, a system in which capital accumulation, economic competition, geostrategic control over resources inevitably spills over into military force. And I think Michael and Sandro are right to draw on Lenin's analysis of the fusion of monopoly capitalism and finance capital, which has reached the most intense manifestations, genocide, for the control of land, natural gas and ports in the case of Gaza, but potential war everywhere for access to so-called critical minerals, water and oil. A core part of the imperialist system are the institutions of the state. Western militaries in particular have enjoyed a long-standing culture of environmental exceptionalism. And while the best estimate we have is that militaries are responsible for 5.5% of global emissions, and that effective decarbonization is impossible without understanding the scale of those emissions, I think we have to argue that greater transparency alone is not enough. Counting and documenting military conflict emissions is crucial, not least because much of the emissions data simply doesn't exist. But we should remember that governments are absolutely aware of the role that militaries play in emissions. Netta Crawford, who's written a seminal book on climate change and war in the Pentagon, argues that the beliefs of militaries, policymakers, and presumably also states about strategic context, threats and fears, lead them to make political and economic and strategic choices, lead them to make those choices, the political, economic, strategic choices that they do. And of course, it's true that they could make other choices, and that's why exposing and lobbying and marching and so on is essential. But I think we rather need to understand what states and militaries do in terms of interests, and more specifically, the class interests of the imperialist powers. It's not a moral question about making different strategic choices. They will do whatever is in the interests of preserving power and the capitalist way of life. So we should point to the contradictions between defense policy and any green industrial policy that the government might come up with. Far from seeing them as one, as Nugi wants us to, you cannot have any sensible green industrial policy while making defense spending your number one priority. And explaining what the military is doing isn't enough. The real question is, what are we going to do about it? I also agree with Michael and Sandro that the rhetoric and practices of wars have changed. The difference between the wars associated with the war on terror after 9/11 and the wars being fought now is that there is no pretense of exporting democracy or defending women's rights or humanitarianism. It's now naked imperialism, direct and open threats to Greenland, Canada, and anywhere else that might benefit the way of life of the American ruling class. It's about MAGA and so on. But where I would put the emphasis in answering the question of why the US war machine has done nothing but lose in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so on, and the fact that China is still rising, and the fact that the establishment is losing domestic public opinion, is because of the failure of the neoconservative version of imperialism. And Trump, in part, is a product of that. One of the reasons why he got elected, though not the sole reason, is that he presented himself as someone who would put an end to forever wars, to the forever wars. Of course, he was lying. Of course, it's impossible for him to bring an end to war under capitalism. But I think it's crucial to recognize the very widespread opposition to war in the West and beyond. And that on some level, that has been a constraining factor for the imperialist powers. Second, I think we have to link warfare and emissions and the attendant diversion of financial resources to the question of austerity. Working class people in the UK, across Europe, and NATO member states, the US and the rest of the world will pay for increases in defense spending. So the emissions generated by war are not abstract. When the UK government wants to increase defense spending by an extra £13.4 billion a year by 2027, we are paying for that. It's coming directly out of the NHS, the crumbling schools, the dysfunctional HE sector, the lack of adequate childcare, and so on. The state narrative is centered on national security and dealing with so-called threat multipliers, while in defense circles, it's vulnerability to fuel deficiency. And all of this requires military readiness. They can have green ammunition, solar-powered tanks, and the rest of it, but the main motivation is to justify a growing military budget. And at the same time, they warn of so-called climateflation, blaming the crisis not on political and economic interests, but on the inevitability of climate breakdown. And if you frame climate change in terms of inevitable war and you focus on the consequences and not the causes, then the military must play a role in climate governance. Of course, they could do things differently, but they won't unless they are forced. And I think one way of addressing the question of militarism is through the question of public spending, which is the same thing as asking, what kind of society do we want to live in, welfare or warfare? And how do we get towards a situation where people are beginning to ask this question? I think we do it by connecting the big picture to issues that concern people's daily lives. Mamdani won that mayoral election on two main planks, the cost of living crisis and Palestine. And whatever reservations we might have about the potential compromises he might make and the pressure he'll be under from the Democratic Party machine, I think it shows that even in a country run by a monster, it's possible for people like him to get into positions of power. And if those free buses are to be actually implemented, then it is a huge step forward for the climate. Now, if he'd run on the sole issue of climate change, I think it's fair to say it would be unlikely that he would have won. Not because people aren't aware or aren't concerned, but because of a sense of powerlessness and alienation that people feel by it. He foregrounded the issues that most directly and immediately affect people in the here and now, what they feel most angry about. And in the process, this could serve to develop a kind of politics where people feel more confident to address issues around the climate. And third, I think all of this calls for a political, ideological, and a class perspective, one that includes calls for disarmament, anti-war mobilization on a mass scale, and the withdrawal of labor in any industry. As with every issue of concern, and particularly the climate, the government will not be persuaded to do what goes against its interests. It has to be forced. And because working people are the first victims of war, whether at home or abroad, they are turning against it. There is a massive anti-war and anti-imperialist constituency of people in the world who are prepared to fight against war. And I think we have to recognize this. So, I mean, I'm sure everybody here reads about all of this stuff. Perhaps we're in a minority, but if you think about the Greenland ice sheet, or species loss, or the dieback in the Amazon, or any other associated horror, it's unfathomable. And then how do we place that alongside genocide, or the hundreds of thousands that have been killed in Ukraine or Russia, or indeed the 26 million people suffering from acute food shortage in Sudan, 500,000 children of which have already died of starvation. The thought of all that horror, I mean, literally makes you sick to your stomach. But the latter, the kind of the war part of it, the killing and death as a result of war, is in a different register because it is more immediate. It's live stream, it's visible, and it's possible to affect some change over that. And I'm not saying it's immediate, but it is something that people feel they can do something about in a more immediate way. So the situation we find ourselves in creates a sense of powerlessness and hopelessness. But I think we should be clear that there are movements that are moving into action, and that because the war and climate fronts are connected, and that connection is a strategic fact, it means that when people do move into taking action, and when they do take to the streets, then they are also taking steps towards dealing with the destruction of the planet. And that's not to say that we shouldn't march on every front. We do everything we can in all the different movements. But it is to say that we have to recognize that people are moving into action. And so not only do we need to go back to an analysis of the bigger systemic picture and immediately get on to the what is to be done question and the attendant debate around that, but concretely make the links conscious, tangible, and urgent.